We have started recording. We are live.
Excellent.
Not live because it's recording. It can't be live. It's recording, right? All right. So my name is Bronson. I am the Meat Life. I got to come up with a nice, good intro, right?
Yeah, you're like one of those like a fancy like sound effects and like
some announcer in the background. All right, and I'm talking today's video. We're talking to Ella Bruce out of Australia, something like
correct.
that, way out on the other side of the world.
It is.
And Ella has some very insightful information to share with everybody about the importance of protein, and the possibility of maybe changing how we think about the quantities of what we eat and what we're getting out of food. And you've heard me say before, and I think you've heard a lot of people in the carnivore realm have talked about it's not just about calories. And I think Ella is going to have some good explanations and kind of explain that to you for you guys. We're also going to talk a little bit about how the things she's going to mention and bring up affect fitness and athletic performance. Ella, you're moving into figure competing. Figure.
Yep,
what's the word
absolutely.
I'm looking for? Figure competition.
So, sorry, what was that?
Your figure competitions is what you're doing right now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've competed previously in some of the other divisions, so bikini and sports model. They were following more traditional diet approaches. So, higher carb, moderate protein, very, very low fat, and all the commensurate hormonal effects that come with that. And anyone who's ever followed that kind of diet can tell you how miserable they can be. And I'm actually moving up a category at the moment into figure, which is pretty much my end goal. That's, where I want to be for the rest of my life. And I'm doing that through what I suppose Amber might call a carnivore adjacent dietary approach. So generally speaking, zero carb with the inclusion of things like coffee, tea, which tend to be accepted, as well as some protein supplements and occasionally MCT oil. So just things like that to help, so I suppose small compromises that I handle well.
Sure.
To improve physical performance.
Okay. And your background in general with all of this stuff, I know you are the most, I have to think of the word, vociferous responder of questions on the internet. So I don't think you've ever written a response that was less than 3 paragraphs. But it's all good information, right? You really dig into a lot of the data. You really you just really enjoy, it seems like, the science and the information behind it. So what's your background? Where does that come from?
So in another life, I was actually studying to become a pilot. So I did a Bachelor of Aviation at Griffith University with a postgraduate that came with that. And believe it or not, flying aircraft is actually not that, let me just silence that. Flying aircraft is actually not that well paid, unfortunately. So on the side, I actually was right into fitness at the time and lost a whole bunch of weight personally, and decided that I would start working as a personal trainer on the side. And it's one of those things, and I know from yourself, having changed industry from IT into to fitness, it's one of those things you find a passion, it just bites you and just like it never seems to let go. So for me, I was a bit of a science and data nerd kind of growing up, and to find this topic that was both wholly fascinating to me, health and nutrition, and also so much information that didn't seem to correlate or work with each other. It was like ticking off all these questions in the back of my head, like how do these pieces fit together? You know what I mean? And like every little...
Yes.
Exactly. And every time that you take a step along this path, you realize that the rabbit hole just keeps going, and it's difficult because, as someone who likes to think of herself as a scientist, I want the solid answer. I want to get to the end state. And it's hard because you've got to realize that you never will. We're constantly changing.
Yep.
So for me, it's like my major hobby, apart from lifting heavy things and eating lots of food, is I get on PubMed and I read up on the new research and things like that pretty much consistently. And I think it's just constantly being so in depth into that world, like the information kind of just eventually gets stuck inside your head.
Yeah. Okay. All right, cool. So we have some, I guess we've had a lot of people in there. So you're in Zero Carb Fitness. You're in a group. That primarily the reason I started that group was, I'm in, not that I frequent it anymore, but in World Carnivore Tribe and Principia Carnivora and all these different groups that are out there on Facebook. And they're primarily populated with people who are trying to heal something, right? There's a lot of people that have a lot of problems with different things. And there's, anytime it seemed like someone had a question that was health related or that was fitness related, hey, I'm trying to gain strength. Hey, I'm trying to, cut and work on body composition. I'm trying to improve my performance in my CrossFit workouts. Like, people didn't either accept, some people got bashed for asking this question. This is the wrong group. You're not in the right group. And then people just didn't have answers. So that's why we started the Zero Carb Fitness group. So some of the questions I think that we've been asked, and really, I guess to start off, before we get too much into those fitness questions, you said you do a carnivore adjacent diet. Do
so
you
I consider
always
myself,
do that, or do you cycle in carbs based on competition schedules? Like, how do you do that stuff?
Yes, that's a really good question. And it's a bit of a multifaceted answer. So if you follow me along the journey with it, the short answer is I don't think carbs are necessary to grow muscle up to a certain point. The reason being is because insulin, being a storage-based hormone, which is both a good and a bad thing, depending on how you utilize that hormone, can trigger muscle growth.
Right.
Now, as you probably followed along the path, if you spike your insulin through the use of protein, you'll also have glucagon and a few different other hormones that also spike at the same time. And that will trigger that protein to be stored. So you'll grow muscle mass. There does come a point, however, where your exercise load, especially as you progress in training, your volume will increase. Now, as that volume increases, the amount of glycogen that you require to meet those training needs also increases. If, for whatever reason, that the amount of glycogen you require is actually more than what your body can make you within a 24-hour period, or at least between training bouts, then there becomes a point where your glycogen stores actually start depleting. Okay. Right? Now, you can improve that amount by increasing your protein intake, which is one of the things that I'm a proponent of. You can also improve it by just adapting to the higher load, i.e. your liver will get better at producing glycogen from protein through gluconeogenesis. Or we can start looking at using carbohydrates as a supplement. Okay.
What about, how does the training program itself play into that? If you're getting adequate rest, cycling through various modalities and not working the same thing within that repletion time.
Exactly. So if you've got a smart training program, for most people, you won't ever require carbohydrates, in my opinion. We know that approximately between 250 and 350 grams worth of protein can be converted into glucose in the liver in a 24-hour period. Now, only about 56%, we'll call it 50 just to be nice, of the protein that you consume can actually be converted into glucose. So we're really looking down the barrel about 125 grams through to about 175 grams of glucose per day that your body can produce you. Right. Now, out of that amount, we have to provide glucose to your brain and all other metabolic functions like red blood cells and other things like that. So now we're probably looking at about 100 grams of glucose that your body can provide you. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is. An hour's worth of training session probably uses up about 20 to 50 grams of glucose, depending on how hard you're training. Sure. So
I'm easily 200 then.
Yeah, obviously. I was going to say, you're pretty much Sarah Connor. So for the majority of people, what I'm trying to get across is that you don't require carbohydrates. Your body is going to make everything that you need. Yep. However, there is a certain point where you do need to increase your carbohydrate intake to meet your training demands. So if you're an athlete and you're doing twice daily training sessions, right, or you are doing an incredible amount of training load, right? To meet that volume requirements, you're going to have to increase your glucose, and your liver just can't provide it. So you'll have to either do some kind of glucose just before training, or you can do a carbohydrate load.
Right.
So that's one part of the answer.
Okay.
The second part, sorry, please go.
Before you get to the second part. So, and the best way to figure that out is, I'm assuming, an overtime tracking of what's going on. Like, okay, I'm training this much, I'm gaining muscle, I'm training this much. Hey, wait a second, I started losing muscle. Let's look at what's going on. Maybe it's needing to add carbs. Maybe it's needing to add protein. Let's try protein for a couple of weeks and see if that helps. Nope, I'm still losing muscle. Okay, there's got to be a process of evaluation, because there's no way to really tell, oh, all of a sudden now I need carbs, right? You got to figure that out.
Exactly. And it does take time. There is no like objective measures. There's only really a subjective feeling as a way of telling. And I hate using that, because you're going to find people who are not in a position where they require carbohydrates being like, well, I feel like it, so I should have it. That's not what I'm saying at all.
Right.
What you'll experience is inability to get a pump, very low vascularity, increased fatigue in the training when you first go through that, a drop in performance, a drop in strength. You'll also notice lack of sleep quality, sex drive will go down, stress will tend to go up. These are all symptoms of high cortisol. Even quality of sleep will tend to go down. So objectively, when you're looking at it yourself, you're like, yeah, you know, I didn't sleep all very well last night. I must need a carb up. And it's like, no, over 3 weeks or 4 weeks, if you're finding that you're having these symptoms develop, then potentially you may be better off finding a way of giving your body more glucose. Maybe that is more protein. Maybe that's training less. You know, maybe that's, in rare cases, cycling carbohydrates into your diet.
Sure. Okay.
The other side of it is as well is that insulin can be very anabolic, right? So whilst I might not require glucose to be able to meet my training demands, I may be able to squeeze some benefit out of spiking my insulin at certain times to be able to, you know, drive nutrients into the muscle.
Sure. Well, it's not just nutrients too. I just read, and I don't know if you've seen this, there was a study that came out a few weeks. It's a couple years old actually, but I just saw it a couple weeks ago, where they did an actual experiment and showed that insulin activates mTOR more than leucine, right? So stay away from protein because it's going to give you cancer, right? But oh wait, leucine actually or insulin has more of an effect on mTOR than protein anyways, right? So
well, can we actually let's take a note of that, because I really want to come back to protein and mTOR.
Okay.
That's a fascinating something I've actually just recently been starting to pull into myself.
Yeah.
So to answer your question regarding insulin, you know, and its triggering of muscle growth, you know, muscle protein synthesis is predicated upon a couple of key factors. You want elevated insulin to force nutrients into the cells. You want to have approximately between 3.2 and about 4.5 grams of leucine that's been ingested. And you want to have approximately 12 to 20 grams worth of essential amino acids. Right? If you meet all three of those requirements, a muscle protein synthesis event will occur.
Okay.
What ends up happening is if you meet all of those requirements, muscle protein synthesis begins, and the cell itself actually starts using up its stored ATP within the cell to then start growing, I suppose, muscle.
Yep.
Over approximately an hour to 2 hours time, that ATP gets depleted, right? And the muscle protein synthesis stops. It then takes a period of time for that ATP to be replenished, in which case another muscle protein synthesis event could occur, right? And this is actually the basis for where people get the idea of having protein once every 3.5 hours for maximal protein synthesis. It's also what Dr. Lane Norton investigated with his PhD doctorate was, is it better off to have pulsatile protein, or is it to have a consistently elevated protein? And the answer is it's pulsatile. And the reason being is because if it's consistent, what ends up happening is the cell activates muscle protein synthesis. You then have all of the ATP depletion, and then it's waiting for a re-elevated increase of leucine and amino acids with insulin to drive more nutrients back into the cell and then trigger more growth. But if it's constant, then it doesn't get that new trigger.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. The question is, and this is always the thing when it comes to good, better, best in a situation,
Yes.
is it's determined mostly, and I think a lot of people forget that all of these things, these recommendations that the myriad of, social media experts and actual experts that are on social media, because there's a difference, that put out there are solely determined by an individual's goals. So when one person says, hey, pulsatile is better, that may be for someone who's trying to do X, Y, or Z, and they need maybe a higher level of efficiency in their muscle development. Whereas someone who's, a 60-year-old grandmom who just wants to get in shape and maybe build some muscle mass to increase her bone density, as long as she's eating consistently and has a good supply of protein in her system, she's probably perfectly fine. She doesn't need to time her meals, right? Because that's not where she doesn't need to go to that level. So
totally agree. And even people who have the same goal, but different lifestyle factors will actually also dictate about, how that's implemented. And people might say, well, it's perfectly ideal to have at least, 5 grams of leucine, just to make it easy, and 20 grams of amino acids once every 3.5 hours for maximal protein gain.
Right.
But when we really look at it, like when you say that, yes, it might be true, but what is the difference? You know what I mean? Is what extra do we gain metabolically for the increased logistical cost to be able to make that occur?
Yeah,
for me, that trade-off actually isn't worth it. I'm fairly close to the muscle mass gain that I want to be at. So for me, the whole idea of eating a meal like a bird every 3.5 hours sounds repulsive. I'd rather have 2 giant meals and feel happy.
I used to do that, and it's really annoying.
Me too.
It's
It
really
sucks.
annoying.
Now,
you got to carry a bag of food everywhere you go, and yeah, it's.
I have so much Tupperware that I never use anymore. It's great. But you've got to make that trade-off. And you've got to decide that at what point does your lifestyle factors influence the decisions that you make regarding your physique. For most of us, this is a hobby, something we enjoy doing, but we also have an outside life. So while yes, technically under the science, having a meal every 3.5 hours is perfect, I would say that a 90% solution is probably having 2 to 3 meals a day that with sufficient protein. That'll get you most of where you want to go.
Yeah. Now, how do you determine sufficient protein?
Okay.
We're going to head this direction now.
Okay, I'm really excited to go down this question. So again, another multifaceted answer, right? I'm going to start off with a criticism of a certain part of the ketogenic community who state that 0.8 to 1.2 grams of protein per day is sufficient, right? Now it's largely based on 2 things, meeting the RDAs, which are based on the absolute minimum required for you to not get a disease, right? For 50% of the population, and then also to stay within quote unquote nutritional ketosis. So keeping your glucose or insulin load below a certain level, so you're constantly producing ketones. So I have a big issue with that. The research actually says that if we increase our protein intake, the serum concentrations of beta-hydroxybutyrate actually increases. So in other words, if we take a blood sample from you and compare your ketone levels pre-bolus, so before you eat something, and then after you've eaten something, there's actually a weak but correlative increase in your ketone concentrations inside your blood as we increase on that. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So protein will not kick you out of ketosis. Your concentration levels will not decrease.
Correct.
Now, some people might turn around and say that when they test themselves, they'll have an increased glucose that's coming up through, or their insulin levels are higher. And you are absolutely right, they are. your insulin levels and glucose are increasing.
Sure.
The reason being is because when you have the protein, your body wants to store it, because guess what? We want muscle, right? That is mediated by insulin. So insulin will increase. But similarly, we don't actually want our bodies don't want to use that protein for energy, right? It wants to store it.
Yeah, and this real quick to get a good segue, this is one of the main conversations that differentiates carnivore or low carb for healing and carnivore and low carb for performance.
Exactly.
Because if someone is insulin resistant or has type 2 diabetes, protein actually can spike their insulin to the point that it's counterproductive for them to eat a lot of insulin. So for somebody who's got, type 2 diabetes, it might be better for them to stay in the 0.6 or 0.8 range in actuality, and not go above that. But for someone who's not insulin resistant, then I'm with you. I say load up on the protein and have a blast.
Right? Absolutely.
So there's two different cases there. So don't.
The other side of it. Absolutely. The other side of it is that when you consume the protein, because your body actually wants to store it into muscle growth or to be able to use it for metabolic functions, rather than using it for energy production, what it does is it actually also spikes glucagon at the same time. Now, glucagon is really fascinating because what it does is it's actually in opposition to insulin, and normally, like they're antithetical to each other. However, when you consume a large bolus of protein, what happens is they actually both come up together, right? And what happens is that as the glucagon is released, it actually forces your muscle cells and other areas to actually release the glucose that they had already stored, right? The reason it does that is because that glucose is then what your body will burn for energy, so not the protein. And then the elevated insulin that allows the protein to then to be taken up into the cells and then used for growth. Does that make sense? Sure. So when you have a large bolus of protein, you will see your blood glucose go up and you will see your insulin go up. It's not that gluconeogenesis has suddenly produced all of this glucose. It's that the glucose that it's already made has now been released and made available to the bloodstream, so that way you can grow. Sure. The next part of it, sorry, go.
I remember the first time I read about this, and it kind of took me a while to wrap my head around. The first time I looked at an insulin index and I saw protein up there with other stuff, I'm like, wait a second, this doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like, wait a second, what's going on here? So yeah, I got you.
And I absolutely want to circle back around through to the insulin resistance. And I'm definitely getting there. The second component is that you'll have some of your bro scientists who'll turn around and say to you that muscle protein synthesis is maximally stimulated at about 1.2 grams per pound per day. Okay, so they'll turn around and say that in that case, there is no benefit to going any higher. If it's not adding to this, then I'm not interested in it, right? And that's actually a fallacious argument, because protein does a lot more for us than just build muscle.
Sure.
And it offers a lot of advantages that other macronutrients don't have. So there's some fascinating research done by Jose Antonio, who's currently the CEO of the International Society of Sports Nutrition, as well as Dr. Don Lehman, and also Gabrielle Lyons. Into
I've heard of the last two. I haven't heard of the first guy.
Okay, so I can send you a link that you can include to the video to read some of his research, and it's fascinating stuff. However, the work of Antonio, he was looking at what I would consider to be a high protein diet, but in the literature is considered a very high protein diet. So what he was looking at was 2 grams per pound of lean body mass in resistant trained male athletes. So us is the short answer. And what he found was that athletes who were consuming protein in these levels were on average consuming 800 calories more than the control. So they were eating enough extra calories that I would expect them to gain 1.5 pounds per week of fat.
Correct.
Right? What they actually found. If it
were carbs or fat.
Correct. Absolutely.
Right.
What they actually found was that these athletes who were consuming extra calories, that's all it was, just extra calories from protein, actually gained more muscle and lost fat compared to the control group. So they were eating 800 calories more,
Right.
all from protein, gained more muscle, lost more fat.
Did they attempt an explanation as to why they thought they lost the fat?
Yeah, they have, absolutely. So there are two components: thermic effect of food and non-exercise adaptive thermogenesis.
Okay.
So this is another rabbit hole we'll have to go down.
So
but
yeah, maybe we can do another video on that, right? Because I assumed the thermic effect of food, the non-exercise thermogenesis was something that I think may take more explanation for people.
Absolutely. I mean, and very shortly, it just means that because your body can't store protein, and it has to use it for energy at some point, it literally just increases your energy expenditure by making you want to do things, so that way you burn it off. That's it.
Okay.
So this is where we then come back through to talking about insulin resistance and a lot of those issues and metabolic health. So people who do have metabolic syndrome absolutely do want to keep their blood glucose low. I totally agree with that. And as part of that, they also want to increase the metabolic flexibility so that they can use both glucose as an energy substrate as well as fat for an energy substrate. And people who, like us, who are very active, are probably very good at using both.
Sure.
But therein actually lies the answer for people who are insulin resistant, is that you need to improve your ability to handle a glucose load. So initially, when you first start out, absolutely, I would recommend that you keep your protein at about the 1.2 to 1.5 grams per pound per day and start increasing your exercise capacity, in whatever that means for you. You know, burn off some ATP, lower your blood glucose level through exercise, and lose some weight. And what we find is that when people lower their weight and they increase their activity, their insulin sensitivity increases.
Yes.
Right? So that insulin resistance decreases, and then therefore their ability to handle increased protein boluses improves. So the short answer is that if you have insulin resistance, I would still be a proponent for a higher protein intake, so about 1.5 grams per pound. And then the remainder of your energy intake made up from fat. I would recommend that you burn ATP, whichever way that means for you. So if that means just a walk, do that. If that means you can do high intensity interval training or weight training or things like that, absolutely do that. And as you progress along your training, progressively titrate your protein intake up over time until you're starting to get into the levels which I would normally recommend for most people.
Okay. Yep. That makes sense. I think, yeah. And again, that's always, with any recommendation, right? That's a starting point. Someone may respond well to 1.2. Someone else may get 1.2 and freak out, and their body goes, no. You go, okay, let's go to 1, or let's go to something different, right? You know, someone may do 1.2 and be fine. You say, let's try 1.5. You know, so yeah, I mean, understanding that. I think the key takeaway for me on that is we know that they respond differently to protein. But if you include some level of activity, then it helps.
Absolutely. And
the combination of those two is kind of what that solution looks like.
And I think, you know, I like summarizing things into short statements. The short answer is that you should have as much protein as you can tolerate metabolically from where you are right now.
Yeah.
And if from wherever you are, if that means that it's 0.8 and that's all you can handle because of your metabolic health, then do that.
Sure.
Just know that your end goal is to be able to push that up into the 2 grams per pound in my recommendation per day eventually. So as you progress along, you know, don't get stuck in this wonderland of like, well, that's what I could do then. That's all I'll ever be able to do. That's not true.
So taking that statement that you had, right, you should be able to eat as much protein as you can metabolically handle. Why the emphasis on protein and not calories?
Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to work out in my head the best way to answer this question.
I figured it might take you a second.
Okay.
Without going on a rant.
I do like a good rant. Okay. to answer the question, we probably need to start to understand what a calorie is
Okay.
and what it's really representing. So a calorie is really just an abstract way of measuring the energy content of a food, right? And I know that probably sounds like a bit of a stuck egg statement, but the reason it's important to make that distinction is because just because there is energy in the food doesn't mean automatically that it's available for you to use.
Okay.
So every food contains a certain amount of carbon-carbon energy bonds, right? So that's where two carbon molecules are attached together and they have a double molecular bond between them. What ends up happening is that your body is able to separate them across, and when those bonds break, it releases energy, and we can actually use that energy to produce ATP.
Okay. Now,
carbs and fat are really just a way of storing food, energy, carbon bonds in a way that your body or we can use. Now, you may have seen research to say that when protein and calories are matched, there is really no metabolic difference between a high fat or a high carbohydrate diet. The results are the same. And that makes a lot of sense when we think about it, because at the end of the day, if we provide a certain amount of carbon bonds to the body, right, then it doesn't matter if we're getting it from a very dense source like fat, or we're getting it from a less dense source like carbohydrates. At the end of the day, it's still getting the same amount of carbon bonds.
Right. Sure.
Right?
In that case, a calorie is a calorie.
Exactly.
Yep.
With some caveats, which I'll get to in a moment. Yep. Now, protein is a little bit different. See, protein actually has the same amount of carbon bonds per molecule as carbohydrates-ish, without getting too technical. Which is why protein is kind of given as the same amount of calories, i.e. 4 calories per gram. Right? But the problem is that these carbon bonds are actually locked behind some nitrogen molecules. So for your body to access the carbon bonds inside a protein molecule, what it actually has to do is has to cleave off this nitrogen, right? Forming an ammonia molecule, which is then eventually converted into urea, which you then urinate out.
Right.
And doing that is actually very metabolically expensive, right? This explains the thermic effect of food. It takes 25% of the calories that you can get from protein just trying to access the calories in protein.
Right.
Right? In this case, a calorie is not a calorie.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So just to clarify that for anybody that's listening, so that means if you eat 100 calories of protein, your body's actually got access to 75 calories.
Exactly.
Right? So you're not accessing, you don't have access to the amount of fuel that the package says on the outside.
Exactly. Now, at the moment, all we've really discussed is the energy in, I'm not going to say calories in, the energy in component of the system. And when you consider that in isolation, we've already agreed that a calorie in is not a calorie out, right? Because it matters what fuel source we're providing.
Sure.
Now, if we start to then look on the other side of the equation where we've got calories out, there's a lot of components that are at interplay. So your hormonal response to eating is different depending if you have a higher insulin load or a lower insulin load. So we know that if you've got a high insulin level, then that will stop lipolysis, so either stopping your body to be able to access its own fat stores. So you would have to burn through whatever energy that you've consumed before then you can start using energy from your body fat.
Right.
Yep. Which is why some people might say that a higher fat approach is more beneficial, just because it keeps your insulin load in general lower. So we know that metabolically, a calorie is not a calorie internally because your response to eating is different.
Sure.
We also know that acellular foods, so foods that have been broken down into, say, a mush and then dried, so flour as an example, have a different response to, say, a whole food. And again, the reason being is because those bonds, the carbon energy bonds inside, are actually locked up behind more processes, without getting into detail, more processes for your body to be able to access, and therefore it actually takes more energy for you to access that energy, which is why whole food approaches tend to have better answers. And again, this is a gross oversimplification, so the scientists back here don't kill me. So we already know that food quality is in itself means just not a calorie is not a calorie.
Right.
We can start looking at fasting, and that's another whole rabbit hole. But we know that your insulin sensitivity is actually improved in the AM versus in the PM due to how serotonin and melatonin both affect your hormones. And so that way eating calories earlier in the morning actually has a lower insulin response than eating in the night. And therefore we know when you eat a calorie is no longer the same. So calories are not a calorie depending on when you eat it.
Sure.
Right. So
and then I'll just throw one other one in there because I think you're going to move on to the next point, and that is health in general. Right. So someone who is active like you and I are, and we're adapted, we have a different response in general because our mitochondrial function is at a higher level, right? Our bodies are saying, hey, I like fat. I'm used to burning fat. I'm going to do this way. Someone who is not in shape, someone who's mitochondrial function. And I say mitochondrial function, what I guess the broader picture is, I'll just say metabolism, right? The function of their body is not as efficient. So it doesn't process food the same. So I can eat 100 calories and my body processes, I get more out of that 100 calories. So I don't need 200 calories to get the same amount of work done. Somebody who's unhealthy may need 300 calories for their body to do the same amount of work that my body does at 100.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so, again, those numbers are like, those numbers are indicative rather than, quantitative. But absolutely, adaptive thermogenesis to overeating is a big thing. And, if you are metabolically damaged just due to lifestyle factors and, choices that you've made getting to that point, your body is going to be less efficient because, it just doesn't have room to be able to store extra energy substrate, which is actually the basis for getting insulin resistance in the first place. So how your body adapts and uses different energy sources will be completely different. You're 100% on. And I think the takeaway from this is that to focus on calories as a measure at creation, as an absolute measure, is insane. You know what I mean? To turn around as an advocate to say that calories in, calories out is all that matters is completely wrong. However, to say that energy balance doesn't matter, or energy in versus your energy output, is incorrect, is also completely false. Because ultimately, our body composition is dictated by your energy balance. I just think that calories are a very poor way of measuring that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It's not a bad guideline in many cases, and I think it plays a role in helping many people quantify where they are and what they're trying to do. But I think it plays into a part of the solution. It is not the solution.
Exactly.
And I think that's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah. And I think the best way to be able to explain this to people in the way I try to is actually using an analogy from firing a rifle. So I know that you used to be in the military just like I am. And you'll know that when you're firing a rifle, essentially, if you aim at the center of target, the round will hit either spot on the target or say off to the top left.
Sure.
Right? So what we know is we're aiming here, but what we're really getting is here.
Right.
Now, if we aim off, right, we can actually bring where the round is hitting the target onto the target, even though we're not actually aiming at it.
Yep.
And what's important about this analogy is it's saying it doesn't actually matter what the number is. The number is completely irrelevant. What matters is that we're consistent. So calories are inaccurate, but as long as we're consistently inaccurate, you'll achieve the results.
Yep.
And this actually creates a cognitive bias where people are like, well, I counted calories and I lost the weight in a way that made sense. It's like, of course you did. You were consistent with what you were doing for a period of time. And when it didn't work, you adjusted.
Right.
Does that mean that calories is what is mattered? The energy intake that you had was in a consistent deficit and therefore you lost weight.
Sure.
But it's not the number that you were eating that was important. It was the fact that you were consistent with what you were doing and you adjusted what you were doing appropriately to hit your goal.
Right.
And that's what I recommend for people. if what you're doing is not working, do something different. There's so many times I see people turn around within the carnivore community whose goal isn't primarily to heal, whatever that means.
Sure.
Um,
for lack of a better response to that, I think it just means eat more fat.
That seems to be the answer we tend to get.
Because that's the answer, right? Well, if your body needs more fat so it can heal, right? That's the blanket answer. We don't go on a rant. We can talk about that one another time, but that's not the solution that we're talking about particularly when we're talking about fitness and performance.
Absolutely.
And body composition, for sure.
Absolutely. And there is a lot to be said about improving metabolic health, and not everyone's goals are my goals. And I totally accept that. And for those people, I think a higher fat approach may be good for them. Sure. Maybe having very, very low insulin from a bolus is a good thing. So a high approach like a PKD is good for you.
Sure.
But what I'm here to tell you is that if your goal is body composition and improved physical performance, then a higher fat approach is probably not what you're looking for.
Yep. Totally agree. I tell people all the time, what are you trying to do? I'm trying to do X. I'm trying to do Y. I'm trying to get stronger. I'm trying to increase this. Okay, just eat more protein. And they look at me like, what?
Everyone says eat fat.
Like, what? What are you talking about? I'm like, look, if you're already doing what you think is a good percentage and you feel like you're maintaining and you're feeling good and you want to improve performance, just add protein. Mm-hmm. Right? Chances are you're probably lower than 1.2 or 1.5 as it is, because most people are. Mm-hmm. Just add the protein and watch what happens. And it's kind of crazy. To a person, you see they start going, oh man, I'm losing fat. Oh, I wonder why. Okay. I'm getting stronger. Oh, okay, cool, great.
Oh, that's funny how that works. I'm like,
and I know that because it's worked for me. Like as I've gone through, we've talked over. It's probably about almost a month ago now that we first really started talking about protein and protein sparing modified fast and intermittent fasting and some of the stuff that Marty Kendall's doing and Dr. Neiman is talking about. I've listened to a lot of Dr. Neiman's stuff, but it wasn't until we talked that I actually really started digging into a lot of his stuff. And I really like the way, and I think this is what everybody says, the way that he breaks things down and explains things is kind of like,
I mean, like, how did I not see this?
Okay. So yeah, the definite focus on protein and not worrying about the fat it's a game changer, I think, for a lot of performance related stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I follow those same people as well. And what I really like doing is I like looking at what they're doing and what people are recommending and why, pulling that apart and trying to work out what I can use selfishly for myself to be able to continue to optimize what I'm doing. And I think anyone in this field probably, the old saying that, psychologists get into the field because they want to understand themselves.
Sure.
It's probably the same thing for me. I got into health and nutrition just because I wanted to understand how to optimize my own health. And now it's just kind of, I like helping other people do the same.
Yep.
And I suppose the way I try it and I approach this is it's all about optimizing body composition for me and physical performance. If something I'm doing isn't improving my health, my fitness, or my physical performance, then I should be doing something else. And that's kind of the way I tend to approach it. Dr. Neiman, I think he has outstanding work, and he does talk a little bit about optimizing body composition. Same as Marty Kendall, he talks about nutrient leverage and how we can use that to be able to improve our satiety and control our hunger, and using that as a function of improving our body composition. And what I like to do is trying to pull apart each of those little components and work out what are the mechanisms that are working behind the scene to be able to get what I want from it.
Okay, cool. What is your experience like how long have you been on the high protein kick?
So probably close to 2.5, 3 years now.
Okay, what were you doing before that?
So prior to that, I was doing a high fat keto approach.
Okay.
And then before that, I was what you'd probably call a protein diet, which was essentially just chicken, broccoli, and rice.
Oh yeah, old school. Okay.
So
yeah, I got to say, so my wife did a figure competition in 2009, And it was one of the most miserable times I've ever spent with her.
Yeah. Oh, I can
horrible.
imagine what it was.
And she herself, she's like, I will never do this again. Like, if this is what I have to do in order to be successful doing this, I am never doing this again.
Absolutely. I mean,
it's horrible.
So this actually, I don't know if you recall, but when I first came across zero carb fitness, I was asking for a lot of help from people about dealing with an eating disorder. Do you remember that?
I don't remember that.
Oh, great. Well, I remember asking you and quite a few other people within the community. And that's actually what brought me to carnivore in the first place.
Okay.
You know, from previous experiences from competing along a protein approach, I actually developed an eating disorder. And I had a coach for my first competition who had me eating approximately 900 calories a day on a high carbohydrate approach. I was doing 2 45-minute sessions of cardio a day plus a weight training session.
Oh.
And as you can imagine, like, I'd walked into the ground. I looked like shit. I felt like shit.
Yeah.
I had amenorrhea, so no period. I had a whole bunch of other issues. And I learned to fear food. So when I was seeing all these people who were, you know, healing,
Yep.
who, you know, were essentially just advocating eat when hungry, stop when full, don't worry about calories. Like, that was a huge breath of fresh air for me. And I latched onto that concept.
Sure.
As, you know, a drowning person onto a life raft.
Yeah.
And I did that for approximately 4 or 5 months. I'd say I did a higher fat carnivore approach.
Okay.
Right. And I stuck with that a lot longer than what I realistically should have, because what I noticed was that I was gaining fat at an alarming rate. And the issue that I was having is that anytime that I was asking for advice in groups like Principe Carnivora or other places, it was just keep eating fat, your body's healing.
Yep.
And what I found was that I was consistently going backwards. Now, as someone who is in the physique world, you know, who is about developing a physique that is showy, essentially,
Sure.
that was very challenging for me. And I ended up actually quitting carnivore and going back to keto for a period of time, because I just wasn't getting the results that I was going for. And I eventually got to the point where I was like, well, this obviously doesn't work for me. And I think a lot of people on carnivore have that same problem.
Yep.
You know, approximately, I'd say almost 30% of people who fall off carnivore fall off because they're not achieving the body composition results they're after.
Yeah, that's probably a good number. Sure.
The reason being, in my opinion, is because there is a mismatch between what someone's individual goals are and the recommendations they're being told in this group. Eat more fat. And the fact is that it doesn't work.
Yep.
I ended up coming back onto carnivore, which is what I'm doing now. And the reason being was because I realized that through the carnivore approach, I had a lot of food sensitivities and other issues that I just remained undiagnosed, and I just genuinely felt better.
Yeah.
And I went on a bit of a kick of trying to work out.
So even though you quit before because you weren't seeing the body composition goals that you were trying to get, you still felt better.
Correct.
Right.
No.
So that is awesome, because that illustrates the different paradigms that are within carnivore, right? We have people that are, I'm trying to feel better. I feel like crap. I've got autoimmune. I've got skin issues. I've got IBS. I've got whatever it may be. And they're just trying to fix that. And then you've got the people who are joining these carnivore groups because they want to lose fat. Right? That, to them, that is their healing. That is what their goal is, whether it be healing mentally, self-confidence, improving performance, whatever it is. Their goal is body composition related. And I see it so many times, and I want to post and respond every time I see it, when somebody says in these groups, carnivore is not a fat loss diet. It drives me crazy. I'm saying the one thing that I love about this diet, this way of eating, is that it can be whatever anyone needs.
In fact, any diet,
right?
Any diet
could be, right? So
exactly.
But I feel like this one is so flexible, it's so simple, and you can take so many different approaches and still have it be successful. There's just a couple basic guidelines you need to follow. It doesn't have to be this whole big thing, right? So
absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Mini rant.
So coming back around through it again. I started to look at what would I do from a ketogenic approach to be able to maximize? Do you want to pause?
Yeah, hold on one second.
So how about flip the programming for
Change tabs on the browser. Just change tabs on the browser. Sorry.
That's all right. So what I started to do was, I'll wait until you're back in the photo.
Yeah, good. I'm good. Good.
Yeah, so what I wanted to do was I wanted to look at what would I do on a ketogenic approach to be able to maximize body composition, and how do I meet that into a carnivorous approach where I genuinely felt better, without the addition of fiber and, gut irritants and all these kind of things. How do I maximize that? And the short answer is that I wanted to maximize protein intake for body composition.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to minimize, or rather, I wanted to meet my energy requirements based on body composition goals.
Mm-hmm.
I needed to leverage nutrient density so that way I wasn't hungry and I was, feeling satiated.
Yep.
And I needed to be able to do all of this in a way that wasn't counting calories, because just from my own journey, I knew that really messed me up.
Okay.
Right. And there was a bit of actually a lot of trial and error before I eventually got there. But the short answer is that it's the exact same approach.
Okay.
So my recommendation for most people is to eat lean meat.
Yep.
Versus fattier meat, whatever lean is for you, to maximize nutrient density in your diet. So from a carnivore, that means the inclusion of organ meats, and I'll get into why I recommend that in a moment.
Sure.
I recommend having a lower meal frequency, just because the research shows that if you're having larger meals less frequently, you tend to be less hungry.
Mm-hmm. And
I also recommend having a certain degree of fasting, however that looks for you, because again, the research shows that if you're pulsatile in your insulin intake, your insulin load, then generally speaking, your hormonal response to food is actually better.
Okay.
So that are generally the 4 recommendations I make for people. So to be a little bit more specific, I tend to recommend that people sit between the 1.5 to 2 grams of protein per day. I actually eat about 2.5, so a little bit higher again, of lean body mass.
That's ridiculous. Go ahead, keep going, but that's ridiculous.
It's a lot of food. It's great.
Food. How did your current breakdown of macros? How does that, just because I want to give people an idea of calories versus what you do as far as more nutrient density focus. Mm-hmm. If you were to take what you eat, fat, protein, carbs, whatever it is, and convert that to calories, are you above or below your BMR?
Oh, I'm well above my basal metabolic rate.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
Well above it.
Okay.
So, I mean, at my lean body mass, if I was to sit in bed staring at a roof, I'd burn about 1750 calories per day.
Okay, and then plus exercise, another 750.
Yeah, about that. So generally speaking, if I was to count calories, I mean, the calculators tend to say I'd need about 2,600 calories to maintain my lean body mass.
Yep.
I actually couldn't tell you exactly what I'm eating specifically, because I very purposefully don't count, just because, again, issues with, Okay. But what I can tell you is that I normally will have between 300 and 350 grams of protein a day on an average day. My fat intake, generally speaking, will be if I'm not doing a protein sparing modified fast or anything like that, would be normally between about 50 to 75, maybe 100 grams of fat. And that's really just depending on my energy output for the day. Okay. And carbohydrate is negligible at best.
Okay.
So the reason I tend to go for those numbers is because, again, the research just shows that a higher protein intake independent of calories has better body composition outcomes. Right.
Okay, I just wanted to kind of get an idea and play those numbers around in my head, and just again, not focusing on the calories, but just seeing how that all plays out in the where it plays. Like if someone were to say, well, what am I actually doing? Because a lot of people need a calorie in order for them to quantify what they're doing. So being able to go back and forth, I think, is can be important to help people.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna frame this from a fat loss perspective. If your goals are to gain weight, then I would recommend that you increase your fat intake in order to start, providing more energy than what your body requires, and then you'll gain weight over time. That's not talking about whether that's good weight or bad weight.
Sure.
That really depends on your dietary habits and your training. However, if you want to gain weight, eat more energy is the short answer.
Right.
So framing this now from someone who's interested in fat loss, in making carnivore a fat loss diet.
Yep.
My recommendation is to, again, eat as much protein as what you can, given where you are metabolically. For me, that is about the 2 to 2.5 grams. For most people, I just recommended 1.5 to 2 grams of protein per pound of lean body mass. So how much do you weigh? Like lean mass?
Lean mass is 165.
165. So for you, I'd be recommending approximately, but anywhere from 250 to 300 grams of protein per day as a starting range.
Yep. Assuming
that you wanted to keep losing fat, I would then actually just try and minimize your fat intake. Right? So I'm not actually going to tell you don't eat fat. I'm not going to tell you have this much fat. What I'm going to talk about is a concept that Ted Naiman talks about, the protein to energy ratio. Right?
Yep.
So in my experience, most people will tend to be weight stable at between 1 and 2 grams of protein per gram of fat. So if you're having, say, if you're eating, say, ribeyes, which are a 1-to-1, or you're eating eggs, which are about a 1-to-1, right? Generally speaking, if that's the majority of your diet, you'll be weight stable, right? If you increase the amount of protein to fat, what you'll tend to happen is you'll reach satiety, so you'll get fuller earlier, and you'll end up actually consuming less calories in total, right? And therefore you become in a negative energy balance and you'll lose weight.
Sure.
Right. So in that case, I tend to recommend people have about the 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 protein to energy ratio. Right. So 3 grams of protein, 2 to 3 grams of protein per gram of fat.
Sure.
As a general rule, eat into satiety, and over time you'll lose fat. And what will happen is you'll actually, as you increase your protein to energy ratio, your fat will tend to decrease. Your hunger will then increase because your body doesn't want to keep losing weight. Right? And then you'll kind of plateau at an area. If you want to keep pushing it down again, then what we do is then we up your protein to energy ratio. So you hit more satiety, which then will then start to level you back down again, and you'll keep going. So for example, I know at the moment you've been doing about 1.5 to 1.
Yeah, I'm doing about 1.5 to 1 Yeah.
And what you've noticed is that you've dropped about 2.5% over the last couple of weeks, which is fantastic.
It was crazy. So I was doing about 220 to 230 grams of fat a day. And I dropped to about 165 to 175 on average. So, 50 grams of fat a day. And within, it was crazy. 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, and 2%, like boom. Also with about 1.5 pounds of muscle gain.
Yeah, absolutely.
So.
And what you'll tend to find is that you'll probably plateau, just again from experience, I'd say you probably end up plateauing at about the 9.5% body fat if you keep doing that, which most people would be ecstatic to achieve, right? But if you wanted to push it lower, I'd then recommend that you bump up that, say to 2-to-1 or 2.5 to 1, right, with your current load. And you'll tend to notice that the total volume of food that you will increase, but the energy that you intake will actually decrease. And then you'll start slowly floating back down into say 7% or.
Right. So basically you're just saying is prioritize the protein and then fill in the rest with what you can with whatever fats it makes sense, right? I mean, it's
exactly. Now, the reason this,
go ahead.
Sorry, the reason this works is that it's actually hacking your satiety. So you get satisfied on a lower energy intake. Right? Now, there are other ways that we can do this as well if you're trying to optimize your body composition. So I'll preamble this by saying that I actually don't think you need, for health reasons, I don't think you need organ meats, right? I'd say that flesh meat, for the most part, as long as you're having a decent amount of fat in there, probably meets almost all of your macronutrient intakes for the most part. Maybe folate might might not hit it. I'm still up in the air about that, but you'll probably be okay. You know, you look at like the Andersons and things like that. You can see 20 years on, they're doing fine.
Yeah, they seem to be doing fine, unless they're doing something on the side that nobody knows about. But right, who knows?
But there's a difference between feeling fine and optimizing for satiety.
Sure.
In which case, there is a lot of research that's been coming out, the excellent work of Marty Kendall, about how much of individual micronutrients are required to maximize satiety, right? And what we found is that even if you are meeting your daily requirements for health, if we actually increase your intake of certain micronutrients, particularly potassium, the folate, the B2, 6, and 12 in particular, omega-3 fats, et cetera, choline, you actually tend to get satisfied again on a lower energy intake without changing your protein intake. So the short answer is that I recommend people take in a nutrient-dense diet, so that way you become satisfied on a lower energy intake because you're meeting all of your body's requirements at a lower level. Now, from a carnivore, that means organ meats. In particular, in my I'm a huge fan of lamb liver. It's just got it's a very mild taste in comparison to others.
See, I cannot do liver, so I do liver pills.
Yep, perfect.
Right, so that's because I've tried liver. I just can't.
It's not a thing you do. That's okay. I'd also like to point out that I'm actually not. I'm not an apostate about avoiding all supplements. You know what I mean? I think that's silly. If you can meet your micronutrient intakes through supplements versus real food, then if that's what you can do, do that.
Sure. And I think there's some supplements that no matter what diet you're on probably makes sense.
Vitamin D3 being one of them. We just don't get enough sun.
Yeah. So I've been taking the same regimen for years, pretty much, no matter what diet I've tried. So I take D3, or I take vitamin D. I do fish oil, magnesium, and now I've added in beef liver pills. So, I mean, those three, I notice a difference when I don't take them. And that's whether I'm doing SAD, keto, carnivore, or whatever else. Like I feel like you got to get those in.
So I prioritize obviously nutrient density in my diet. However, I still hedge my bets. So I do the same thing. I've got vitamin D3. I take a multivitamin every day. I probably don't need it.
Sure.
It's probably just making an expensive pee, but I've got it just in case. I take the triple strength omega-3s just again because I want to make sure I've got a good ratio of that for hormonal health. I do take magnesium, particularly around bed, because it helps me sleep better. And I also use potassium salts.
Okay.
Just because, again, we tend to be deficient in potassium in general. And believe it or not, of all the micronutrients, potassium is actually the strongest driver for satiety.
Right.
So we've actually found that intakes as high as 9.3 grams of potassium per day is optimal for minimal hunger.
Interesting.
Flesh meat actually tends to be quite low in potassium. So if people eat, as an example, if you were to eat 1 pound of meat and then you have that same 1 pound of meat heavily dosed in potassium salt, you'll actually be a lot more satiated.
Interesting. Interesting. And the idea is behind nutrient density and satiation is that your body will auto-regulate when it gets the nutrients it needs.
Absolutely.
Right. So again, we're playing a gray line that we don't want people to, because especially for people who are just starting something like this, a lot of people don't know what it really feels like to be full. So for anybody that's new, please be careful with this information, because you may either feel full and you're not really full. You may have been full 20 minutes ago and you're still eating.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm always wary when people are giving advice to newbies coming in saying, just eat till you're full. Right. So many people have no idea what that means. Right. So I like giving people that are just starting some numbers to work off of. And then once they're used to it and they kind of understand how it feels to work in that range, then I can say, okay, you know what? Why don't we throw the numbers aside for a little bit and just do what you want to do and see how it feels.
Yeah,
That's kind of how
absolutely.
I approach it.
So I think this is actually a really good opportunity. But so my issue with a lot of these videos and podcasts is that I listen to this, and all this information is fascinating. But I always walk away and I'm thinking, like, how can I apply this? Like, what does this actually mean to me?
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do is I want to answer that question for your listeners. You know, so let's say that you feel better on a carnivorous approach, but you're not losing weight or you're gaining weight, right? And you come to either of us and you're asking for advice. How do I stop the weight gain? How do I start optimizing my health and my body composition using a carnivore diet?
Yep. The
short answer is that I would go look at the nutritional information at the back of everything that you're eating. Look it up on MyFitnessPal and work out what the protein to energy ratio of your food is, right? As a short answer, things like whole rotisserie chicken, if you eat from nose to tail, is about a 2-to-1 protein to energy ratio. A 90% lean beef is about a 2-to-1 protein to energy ratio. Meat with like what I would call light marbling is about a 2-to-1, and meat with heavy marbling is about a 1-to-1.
Right. So
what I would say,
so everybody knows protein to energy. What she's saying is protein to fat. Right?
Yes.
The fat is the energy. So when we say protein, the reason the phrase is protein to energy is because the same concepts apply whether someone's ingesting carbs or fat. So
absolutely.
Because we're talking about a carnivore diet, we're primarily talking protein and fat and what that ratio is, gram to gram.
So what I would recommend is look at all the foods and work out what foods have a 2-to-1 of protein to fat ratio in grams, and eat to satiety of those foods. Now, satiety means something different to everyone, as you mentioned before. So in this context, satiety means not that you are Christmas Day full like some people would recommend, right? Satiety.
So awesome. No.
I know, I do enjoy doing that. But satiety in this instance means that you are satisfied to put your fork down and that you would be happy to not eat for another 6 to 8 hours. And if you find that you want more food within less than 6 hours, I would say that you probably didn't eat enough in that meal.
Sure.
And if you're finding that the idea of food being repulsive after having had that food and you're feeling sick or clothes don't feel good afterwards, then you've probably eaten too much. And that's how I would test and judge. You know, does it take me 6 to 8 hours to feel hungry again? Perfect. Right.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good way to go.
The last piece of the advice is that find whatever way that you can to improve your micronutrient intake carnivorously. So, for example, cured meats like lean ham actually has a lot more of certain minerals in them that actually improve satiety. So, you know, including some things like ham. I'm not saying bacon, but ham might be beneficial. Bacon's fine too, but within a 2-to-1 ratio.
Oh, the bacon.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. I'd say include organ meats. I'd say have a variety of meats as best you can from different cuts, from different parts of the animal. And just eat to satiety. You know, I'd say hedge your bets and have the supplements that are required. I would definitely be looking into using potassium salts on your food with food, just to, again, improve your satiety.
Sure.
And understand that whilst I'm not telling you to count calories, the advice that I'm giving you will naturally decrease your energy intake without having to do it. So although you're eating less energy, it's not something that you're actively trying to do.
Right. So this is the advice, this is the explanation behind eat till you're full. Right. So yes, we want you to eat till you're full, and that's a great way to live. No stress. You're not counting anything. But you may need to track and kind of learn what that means at the beginning. Right. So there's nothing wrong with that. Like everybody wants to say, oh, don't track. And it drives me crazy because nobody comes into this knowing what exactly they need to be eating.
Exactly.
So tracking is part of the education process of learning how to follow this diet. To a point, like, well, you don't need to. you know?
Said differently, I think we decide what to eat. Your body decides how much.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And essentially what I'm telling you now is the advice I'm giving is what foods you should select to eat
Sure.
so that you naturally eat less. That's
Right.
it. I don't want you to be hungry. I just want you to choose foods that are going to help you towards your goal, not take them away from you.
Yep.
And frankly, if a higher fat approach isn't achieving the goals that you're after, then try something else.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the biggest thing. Be flexible. Okay. The goal doesn't change, but the plan may change. Just don't get stuck in one thing and be like, well, if this doesn't work, I'm not going to do it. Right. So there are so many different ways to implement this. Be flexible, ask questions, and kind of go from there.
The very last piece I'd like to cover, if we can, is the whole idea of rabbit starvation or mal the caribou. Right. So
that
I get
was
this
the
a lot.
actual when I told the world that I was going to try this. That was the first thing I was warned about.
Okay. Well, I'm glad I can bring it up then. So I'll caveat this by saying that protein poisoning, which is the technical name for rabbit starvation, is actually a real thing.
Sure.
Yes, I've experienced it. I know what it feels like, and no, I didn't die. It's actually not that big of a deal. So let's talk about, first of all, how to recognize if you're having protein poisoning or rabbit starvation. What you'll feel is a sense of being exceptionally full. So you'll eat to satiety and you will be repulsed by the idea of food, but you'll be craving fatty foods, right? So you'll want to eat despite the fact the idea of eating feeling disgusting to you.
Yep. Okay.
Right? Now, this isn't to be confused with people who have a bad relationship with food, who'll naturally just want to eat regardless of hunger and satiety cues anyway, and that's a completely different intake.
Yeah.
To be achieving any kind of protein poisoning level, I would say that you need to be, for a female, less than 15% body fat, males less than about 11 to 10, and having less than 20 grams of fat per day on average, right? Now, Amber O'Hearn has spoken about, and even Tristan from Primal Health, or whatever his channel is, he's spoken about how they've done protein sparing modified fasts in the past, and they felt outrageously hungry and they had low energy and they felt bad and they had what they were calling rabbit starvation. Now, what I put to you is that that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, if you do want to push below a certain level of body fat, there becomes a case where not being hungry and eating to as much as you want just isn't going to work. And we're going to have to make some form of lifestyle sacrifice to be able to get that low.
Sure. And that's a decision that each person has to make based on what they're doing and why they decide they want to do that, right? I mean,
exactly.
Yeah. We're not advocating that everyone should do that. That's a totally personal decision.
Absolutely. Now, to put this in perspective, to achieve rabbit starvation and get that low, and this is some of the experiments I was playing with, I was literally eating kangaroo mince, which is 2 grams of fat per 100 grams, so nothing, which I had boiled and then strained to remove the fat. Oh God, you have no idea. I was eating egg whites exclusively and protein powder, you know, so very, very, very low fat intakes.
Yeah.
Whilst also training and having high energy requirements. So this is the kind of food that I'm saying you'd need to have a protein poisoning or a rabbit starvation event. So this doesn't apply to almost any carnivore.
Yeah, yeah.
However, what I will say is that I lost fat very, very rapidly.
Yeah.
Yep. I had low energy. My sex drive decreased. My sleep quality decreased. My mood decreased, and I was hungry. And these are not symptoms that are linked specifically to protein poisoning or rabbit starvation. They're linked to a low calorie intake.
Yeah.
You know, so anyone who's pushed their body fat down that low before will tell you these are all symptoms of just getting lean.
Sure. Super lean.
Super lean, like lean with like capitalized and an underline, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So what I put to you is that if you're worried about rabbit starvation on a higher protein approach, don't. If you're worried about not being in ketosis because of a higher protein intake, well, you know, being in ketosis isn't a panacea anyway, and it's probably not that important. But even then, we actually know that increasing protein intake will increase your ketogenic levels, or at least your ketone concentrations in your blood. So don't worry about that. And if you are in a point where your protein to energy ratio is that high that you are in a protein poisoning event, then you're not going to die. It'll be uncomfortable and you'll feel a little bit miserable, but it's a sacrifice you might want to make relevant to you at that time to be able to achieve a goal. You know what I mean?
And it's
so it is fixable.
You're not stuck there, right?
Well, I mean, to give you an idea of how quickly it is to get out of it, I'd have incredibly low energy levels and I just feel miserable. And every so often I would break and I'd up my fat intake just a touch. One egg was enough to get me out of it. Pull me back from the edge, and all of a sudden I felt satiated again. You know what I mean?
Okay.
So just know that it's not so bad. It is a tool in your toolbox you can use. But for the majority of people, you won't ever need it, and it's probably never going to be a consideration for you.
Right. Awesome. Before we take off, let me ask you one more question, because this is a common question that we get in the group, and that is, how long did it take you when you started doing carnivore? And I know you did things before that, so it may be a different answer than what we get sometimes, for your athletic performance to adapt compared to your lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely. So in total length, it took me about 4 to 6 weeks before I could say that I was at my normal performance levels. And that's just explained by the fact that it takes time for my liver to be able to increase how much glycogen it can produce. Through gluconeogenesis, it does take time to up ramp. Once I hit those levels, I think my performance went back to normal.
Okay. And your primary workout is mostly strength training, bodybuilding style, or are you doing
almost exclusively?
Okay.
That said, I use a lot of myo-rep techniques. And so things where I'm working well beyond failure, which are very glycogen dependent. 100 rep sets after having done failure, for example. So I am a very glycogen dependent athlete.
Okay.
Now my performance since being on carnivore has actually skyrocketed. Now I think a lot of people who do carnivore find the same thing.
If they're patient.
What's that, sorry?
If they're patient.
If they're patient, absolutely. So my recommendation with that is that stick with it. It does actually get better. At first I was like, this is miserable. But once you do get over that little bit of an adaptation period, the hump, I found my physical performance as being nothing but improved. I've grown faster than I've ever done, especially compared to keto, but actually faster than what I'd had on a higher carb approach as well. And I'm leaner, I'm not hungry, I'm not miserable. It's just all in general, it's better.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you very much. That was way longer than I thought it was going to be. We did an hour and a half. Can you believe that?
No, I absolutely can. And the funny thing is there was like 4 or 5 topics, which are like massive like rabbit holes I wanted to go down.
We just touched the surface of some of them. Well, maybe we'll do this again. Guys, for those of you listening, regardless of what page you see this on, if you have questions, please put them in the comments, ask questions. Ella will be happy to respond. I'll be happy to respond. It could give us ideas for maybe doing another talk sometime and bringing up some other topics and things. So you have any parting words of wisdom, buddy?
Honestly, just the fact that I completely agree with you. If there are any questions, please send me a message. Joining the groups that I either moderate or I participate in: Zero Carb Fitness, ketogenic bodybuilding, and also Nutrient Keto. Hit me up. I'll answer any question I can. If you've got questions about any of the research studies or position statements that I use to form my opinion, let me know. I have this Bible of documents with like some 1,000 studies that I use. So I can send you the link to any of those and, show you where it's at. And the final thing is, don't fear protein. It's the biggest lie within the keto community. Embrace it. It's a tool, just like any other tool. And I think that exactly in your own experience, when you up your protein intake, you'll find that only good things happen.
Absolutely. Awesome. All right. Take it easy. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Ed. Bye.